What I'd like to talk to you about today is this. In the previous sessions, we've been examining China, highlighting the idea that the US-China relationship resembled a marriage now heading for divorce. From there, we transitioned directly into World War I. There are two main reasons why we shifted focus to World War I. First, the current rivalry between the United States and China, particularly China's behavior, is strikingly similar to how Kaiser Wilhelm's Germany acted in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Many scholars of international relations often draw on the German model to explain China today. That's the first reason. The second is this. The global financial economic system we live under today, post-1945, was shaped through the experiences of both World War I and II. So it's crucial to understand why we're discussing those world wars and how they inform our understanding of today's system. This isn't a digression from our main thread of study. It's actually central to it. China today resembles Germany at the turn of the 20th century in many ways. The emergence of a singular, unchallenged leader, what China calls its people's leader, may seem like a personal power grab. But academically, we understand it as a consequence of deeper structural foundations. There are specific institutional and societal structures in China that make this outcome likely. So China's current political configuration has inevitably nudged it toward a quasi-monarchical system. It was never a democracy to begin with, but power did at least circulate among elite factions, a kind of rotational consensus among political clans. Now that has given way to one-man rule or the dominance of a single faction. Such a system seems inevitable because of the structural trajectory China has taken. You already have a general sense of this, I'm sure. We've been covering it over the past several sessions, haven't we? So you've got the background. Today, we're going to dig deeper into that structure, using Germany as a useful model. Let's apply that model and explore it further. Germany was a latecomer. It achieved unification quite late, but its geographic position was highly advantageous. Europe narrows into a peninsula as you move westward, all the way to the Iberian Peninsula, and the bottleneck of that narrowing landmass was occupied by the Germanic peoples. This broadly includes modern-day Germany, Austria, and even Hungary, stretching up toward Norway as well. Once unified, this region became the most strategically significant in Europe. Still, Germany was a late entrant compared to Britain and France, so it lagged behind in colonial expansion. But the German people were diligent, disciplined, and highly capable. That excellence allowed them to industrialize rapidly and catch up economically, but by then, there were no open export markets left. Britain and the US had already locked down most of the global markets. That was the reality Germany faced. So they began projecting power outward into bordering territories, asserting their influence wherever their borders allowed. Germany sought to establish a German Austro-Hungarian empire. This wasn't driven purely by imperial ambition. From a Marxist perspective, Marx argues that the economic base determines the societal structure. In that sense, Germany's economic base left it little choice. Germany needed to export capital and invest abroad in order to generate return. So it projected power outward, especially around its borders. It pursued both unification and expansion. To become an empire, key strategic resources must be secured. Then and now, food is the most critical resource. No empire can sustain itself if it relies on others for food. That would disqualify it from true imperial status. Cut off food and the empire loses all power. It starves. So an empire must control fertile plains for food production, as well as energy resources. These core resources are non-negotiable for imperial power. One way to secure them is through colonial expansion. Germany invested in expanding its borders and acquiring colonies. It did attempt ventures in Africa and China, but as a continental power, its main focus remained in Europe. In Central Europe, despite royal intermarriages with Britain, despite being related through both paternal and maternal lines, and despite close business ties with Britain, German, and British bankers, were competing fiercely for dominance in Central Europe. This discussion draws from the book Clash of Empires. Now let's turn to China. Today's main focus is on China's current strategy. We all know China's One Belt, One Road initiative. At its core, it's this, commonly referred to as One Belt, One Road. There are several reasons behind this strategy. First, to secure stable and safe energy supplies. China is an energy-hungry giant after all, so it needs to ensure energy security. Second, to open and secure markets for its products. But more importantly, since 2010, China's exports to the US have been stagnating, partly due to the slowdown of the US economy. As a result, China found itself piling up excess industrial capacity, too much steel, cement, machinery. Letting it sit idle wasn't viable, so here's what they did. They lent money to countries like Pakistan and Sri Lanka, which was then used to purchase Chinese steel and cement, and dispatched Chinese engineers to carry out infrastructure projects. In short, they financed their own exports through overseas lending. That's the grand design behind this initiative. And this came at a time when the global economy was struggling, especially in the aftermath of the Lehman Brothers collapse. China had already created ghost towns domestically, but the announcement of One Belt, One Road was met with international enthusiasm. Infrastructure investment tends to stimulate economic growth, which is why it was welcomed. Now, when it comes to how China secures its energy, it's worth understanding the incredibly challenging conditions it faces. Take Kazakhstan, for example. It's a vast country. It currently ranks third globally in Bitcoin mining. After China banned mining, operations fled, many to Kazakhstan, and the US. Kazakhstan, as expansive as it is, has an oil field called Kashagan near the Caspian Sea, a deep, costly reservoir to develop. To bring oil or natural gas from Kashagan, there are only a few logistical options. One is via the Black Sea, passing through Turkey's control over the Bosporus Strait. Another is through Anatolia and northern Israel, reaching China through the Mediterranean route. If they opt for maritime transport rather than overland routes, they first need to transport it overland a vast distance to the sea. So one might think, why not just lay a pipeline from Kazakhstan to Alashankou in western China, Xinjiang in other words? Build a pipeline through Xinjiang. And the distance into China would be much shorter, right? But whether the energy is gas or liquid, that logic often overlooks the basic economics of land versus sea transport. Overland transport is drastically more expensive. And that's precisely my point. This is the type of calculation China is grappling with. China is laying pipelines from neighboring states like Russia and Kazakhstan. But even when the energy enters China, that doesn't solve the problem. We often think of China as a single entity, but the industrial and educated workforce is concentrated in the eastern provinces. So even within China, the energy must travel another 3,000 kilometers. The pipeline must span that entire stretch inside China. That's a massive logistical undertaking, right? Now here's the key point. If China successfully completes a pipeline from the Kashagan oil field all the way to the western interior of China, then China could achieve a form of energy self-sufficiency. Currently, China is vulnerable to western choke points, strategic pressure points. But if this pipeline succeeds, those choke points lose their grip. Now ask yourself, would Kazakhstan truly enjoy political autonomy from China? Or would it lose that independence? Imagine for a moment that you are an advisor to President Xi. You've secured a pipeline from this critical oil field, delivering oil to China's western frontier, and suddenly the Kazakh government shifts to an anti-China stance. Much like what happened with Ukraine. Backed by Western influence and pressure, the country democratizes and turns against China. Then wouldn't China be compelled to respond as Russia did with Ukraine? China would either have to ensure Kazakhstan's elites are all pro-Beijing, or if that fails, establish a de facto colonial administration. As I lecture on geopolitics, I realize your generation often hears the term imperialism, but rarely reflects on why it exists, why it operates as it does, or why it may be considered harmful. It's a generation that hasn't seriously wrestled with these questions. In fact, many tend to think like this. Imperialism was just a relic of a barbaric past, where problems were solved through violence and conquest. It's viewed as a relic of a bygone era. Challenging that assumption is a central theme of this course, the so-called universal order we live in today. What we might write in capital letters as order is actually a highly exceptional form of global order. Historically, the normal condition has been imperialism. And this, what we're seeing, is precisely that. China is now being pushed to behave like an empire. It must turn Kazakhstan into either a vassal or a quasi-vassal state. On the surface, the Belt and Road Initiative looks like a bold infrastructure program, but compare it with Germany. Germany, too, eventually attempted to dominate Europe once and failed, then tried again under Hitler. The Germans coined the concept of Lebensraum, living space. From an aggressive geopolitical view, one reminiscent of Hitler's, this region becomes China's own Lebensraum, its vital space for survival, because this is where the energy is. Why did Rome conquer Egypt? What was the real reason? To see the pyramids? Because the Sphinx looked majestic? Because Caesar wanted to meet Cleopatra face to face? Why did Rome turn Egypt into a client state? What did Egypt provide that Rome so desperately needed? It was wheat, grain that Egypt supplied. Without Egypt's grain, the Roman Empire would not have survived. Likewise, China is compelled to take on an imperial posture externally, which in turn causes its internal politics to become more rigid. If that causal relationship were airtight, it would be dissertation worthy. It may not be perfect, but we're seeing a striking resemblance, aren't we? Because China is pursuing imperial strategies abroad, its domestic system is mirroring that same imperial logic, a kind of performance. China is unmistakably on a path toward becoming an empire. Of course, it doesn't present itself as imperialist from the outset because the United States is watching closely, along with other Western powers aligned with US public sentiment, so it can't openly declare an imperial agenda. Instead, it lends money. We're talking billions of dollars. $1 billion is roughly 1 trillion Korean won. More precisely, 1 billion USD is about 1.5 trillion won, and countries across the globe owe China these amounts. Political scientists see it this way. To protect its overseas investments, China will ultimately need to project geopolitical power. How else do you enforce repayment of that debt? Among ordinary individuals, people like us, even personal lending can result in default. But if you're owed a lot and emotions run high, you can sue them, take this case to civil court, or maybe even press criminal charges. There are governments, there are courts, but in international affairs, there are no courts like that. What exists now is mostly symbolic. It's just for show. The real system runs on power dynamics. So how do you collect on this kind of debt? This is what imperialism really is at its core. Why did Britain maintain such a vast navy across the globe? Sure, they claimed it was altruistic, that free trade was good for the global family. That was the official rationale, at least. It's similar to how the US justifies its actions today. But as we discussed previously, Britain is different from the US, right? How so? Britain was a textbook imperial power. In simple terms, it was heavily invested abroad. It had assets in places like India and China. So if you look at it that way, why does the US maintain its navy? The US is a debtor nation. And that's why lumping the US into the imperialist category shows a lack of understanding by those using that rhetoric. They're misapplying the concept. So then why does the US maintain a powerful navy viewed in that context? Why did Britain maintain its naval power? Quite simply to collect on its debts. Let's say I've invested in Latin America or China, and then they default. They say, tough luck, we're not paying you back. What do? You send in the fleet to enforce repayment, right? That's imperialism, nothing more, nothing less. Now, the US is a debtor nation, so why does it maintain a navy? To fend off anyone coming to collect? So, while we often call the US an empire metaphorically, it doesn't really fit the strict definition of imperialism. China, on the other hand, is laying down this entire network and intends to expand it. To protect these interests, as I mentioned with the Kashagan oil field example, these are all neighboring countries around China. China will need to project power into these regions. If an anti-China regime arises and defaults on its debt, China simply cannot tolerate that. And that is imperialism. China is heading toward empire. And that brings us to the issue now confronting us, perhaps the most critical geopolitical crisis facing the global community. China is accelerating in this direction. And we are witnessing that performance unfold right now. This is what the German Austro-Hungarian Empire looked like, vast and expansive. They dominated the entire Central European interior. Kaiser Wilhelm II proposed the Berlin-Baghdad Railway project, which closely mirrors what China is doing now with the Belt and Road Initiative. He said, "We have the technology. We'll build railroads to the Middle East." It wasn't romantic idealism. It was about securing access to oil. That was the period when the world was shifting from coal to oil, right before World War I. So the Middle East suddenly became strategically crucial. The idea was to link the German Austro-Hungarian Empire with the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans had failed to modernize and had become a paper tiger. Germany tried to pull the Ottoman Empire into its sphere of influence, saying, "We may have missed out on overseas colonies, but we'll dominate Central Europe." That would bring in grain fields like Ukraine in the east and oil-rich regions to the south. It was a sound strategy. In effect, it meant a direct confrontation with Britain, which was already active in the Middle East. And over Ukraine's wheat fields, which are now a global issue, it meant inevitable friction with Russia. China's Belt and Road Initiative has been covered extensively in Korean media, but without a geopolitical lens, is often misread as just a story of China's economic development. Yet to those with geopolitical and historical awareness, it's clear this is China preparing to exert power in every direction. To be clear, few serious international relations scholars believe this will succeed. The notion that China will colonize the heart of Eurasia has very few believers. What we should worry about is this. As China heads down this path, heightened global tension is inevitable. If we're being coldly analytical about Taiwan, and I personally agree with this view, China's core interests aren't actually in the east. Geographically, China's layout is quite unusual. Its entire coastline is on the eastern side. It has the South China Sea, yes, but no northern or western seas. Now look at us, Korea. We have seas to the west, south, and east. What about Japan? It's surrounded entirely by water. That's what we call a strategic location. Excellent geography. Korea, too, isn't in a bad spot. But China, it's in a tough spot. It only has access to the sea on one side. But here's the thing. China is putting on displays of muscle along this coastline because the US is stationed across the ocean. And that coastline is China's geopolitical showroom. This is my personal analysis. That region is China's geopolitical showroom. China's so-called first island chain includes Korea and Japan. They claim the East Sea and Japan as part of their sea, the first island chain. They say this is our vital maritime zone, our lifeline. But the truth is, they've never really operated a serious navy. The Chinese navy has no real history. And what's the one story they always bring up? That during the Ming dynasty, a eunuch sailed giant ships carrying elephants and giraffes. But that wasn't a military conquest or expansion. It's just a recorded tale of a big ship and exotic animals, nothing more. Do we know of any real Chinese naval legacy? Like China's navy dominated and crushed its enemies? No, not at all. Yet they've drawn this first island chain across the map, claiming everything out to the western coast of the Philippines. Naturally, that includes Taiwan and Korea too. The second island chain pushes even further into the Pacific, centered around Guam. To Chinese nationalists, this feels like, yes, the Great China is rising, but in practical terms, it's meaningless. Among the countries in this region, there isn't a single one that's both strong and irrational. If they're strong, they're rational and open to diplomacy. And if they're weak, sure, maybe harder to deal with, but most are peaceful and don't pose a threat. Look at the Philippines. Is it surrounded by lunatics? Of course not. Do you honestly believe Japan is strong and barbaric? Do you feel unsafe visiting Japan, like you might disappear or something? And Korea? We're one of the most peaceful nations on earth. This is the tricky part though. But that regime just freezes when China turns off the tap. And so the reality is, aside from the Taiwan issue, China has virtually no real geopolitical interests in this region. These countries have overlapping interests and are ready to negotiate. Stability in this sea is equally important to everyone in the region. These are rational actors, open to business and diplomacy. Look how far we've come through business cooperation here. If one country holds the core technology, another mass produces components, and another assembles and sells the final product. We've built a fantastic supply chain collaboration over the past 20 years. Japan, Korea, and China have all benefited. Mutual wins. But now, for younger generations watching this unfold, President Xi keeps making noise in this region relentlessly. Why? Because the United States is just across the ocean. It's dramatic and visually impressive, yes. But according to serious geopolitical analysts, a war over Taiwan isn't something we should be panicking about. Because China's core strategic interests aren't actually in the east. Its real choke points, its vulnerabilities are in the west. The first of these choke points is the Strait of Malacca, a true strategic lifeline. Singapore patrols the area, but in reality, it's safeguarded by British and US naval forces. The strait is narrow but incredibly long. Roughly a third or at least a fifth of the world's trade passes through this narrow passage. And that's because the region is surrounded by economic giants. If this strait is blocked, ships have to take a long detour. And if this route and others are blocked, what's next? Australia's waters. That's all territory governed by Australia, New Zealand, and US-aligned powers. So if it really comes down to a showdown and China refuses to play ball, would the US do to China what it did to Russia? Would the US hit China economically without sending a single tank? According to Peter Zeihan, if that happens, 500 million people in China could starve. Yes, 500 million Chinese. China is much easier to blockade than Russia, which has access in all directions, including the Far East. But China, block one choke point, and it's over. The second choke point is the Strait of Hormuz. So what is China's dream? To essentially colonize Pakistan, build a port there, and construct a pipeline? Looks close on the map, but it's incredibly far, right? And even if the oil enters China, that doesn't solve the problem. Because there's nothing out there in that region of China. It's just shepherds. Pastoral land stretching for miles. It's no small feat, is it? These two choke points define the challenge. That's why many geopolitical experts say China has no viable future. People like Peter Zeihan go as far as to ask, what future does China really have? China cannot become a true empire. Block those two routes and it's game over. Only 3 nations in the world have naval power capable of patrolling this choke point. The US, of course, then Britain and Japan. But even Japan isn't likely to project power this far. They do patrol the area thanks to their blue water navy, but they rely on allies for refueling, then resume patrol, rearm, and return. It's a rotating cycle. But if China tries to patrol here and gets into a standoff with the US, they'll have to coordinate with Iran or find some other workaround, which is unlikely to be easy. What if China becomes so close with India that they practically form one nation? In that case, China might stand a chance. But that would be harder than, say, Korea and Japan becoming one nation, not through conquest, but by forming a union like the European Union, which is already nearly impossible. At least Koreans and Japanese look alike and share a great deal of cultural similarity. Sure, we've had historical tensions, but To outsiders, we're barely distinguishable, like how Portugal and Spain are rivals, despite being so similar, because our cultures and even our vocabulary are very much alike. Take the subject, Korean language in school, Gukyo. We don't just call it our language. The term uses a word composed of Chinese characters. But from which country? This was coined in Japan, not China. Most of the Chinese character-based words we use today were created in Japan. That's why the words in Chinese newspapers often feel unfamiliar to us. Words like science and philosophy, those are Japanese coinages. Why? Because who first embraced modernity? Was it China, Japan, or Korea among the Sino-cultural sphere? Who absorbed modern civilization first? Who translated Dutch dictionaries? Who translated English and French dictionaries? Someone had to do it first so others could follow. So who was it? It was the Japanese over a period of centuries. And that's where we got much of our terminology and system. So if we establish fair and practical rules based on shared interests, Korea and Japan are already closely tied economically. And in theory, they could even become one unified entity someday. But between China and India, that's practically impossible. The ethnic divide is clear and there's very little overlap. Unless China turns India into its own backyard, this region will never be China's domain. This region would be more like India's sphere of influence if the US doesn't patrol this area regularly. Historically, India and Japan have enjoyed close relations. During the prosecution of Japanese war criminals, the Indian judge actually declared them not guilty. At the International Military Tribunal, where judges from several nations presided, the Indian judge probably abstained because he believed those notorious war criminals were not guilty. Japan and India have remained friendly. Japan has invested significantly in India. India is the largest consumer of its own cultural content and produces the most films in the world. I read recently that India's cricket players, kind of like baseball, earn huge salaries. We may not know the player's name, but he earns far more than Premier League stars like Son Heung-min. Bollywood stars often out-earn Hollywood celebrities. India is a unique country, a truly independent cultural sphere. That's why global geopolitical analysts often say, China's long-term interests lie in the West, not in the East. So why is it trying to project power to the East? Because of domestic political incentives, of course. The East is more visible, dramatic, and connects to the US narrative. But the Belt and Road Initiative is about something else. China is trying to shore up its vulnerabilities in the West. But most observers think this will not succeed. It's not easy. China consumes an enormous amount of oil. Its CO2 emissions surpassed those of the US long ago. The top line on the chart represents how much oil China imports from the Middle East. To be fair, it's not just China. We face similar challenges too. But Korea isn't a decisive player in this grand geopolitical game. So when we look at US-China rivalry, we do so from the sidelines. China is actually in a better position than we are. We're even more vulnerable. If China loses access to the Strait of Hormuz and Malacca, experts say it could only sustain a fight over Taiwan or the first island chain for 100 days. If China confronts the US over Taiwan or that zone, and the US avoids direct naval engagement but seizes control of Malacca and Hormuz, then China could only hold out for 100 days, maximum. Of course, that assumes that Taiwanese resist like Ukrainians have. If they instead welcome unification, the whole scenario changes. But even if China successfully takes Taiwan, we would have to imagine a Chinese navy patrolling both Hormuz and Malacca. Peter Zeihan makes an interesting point here. Even without active US patrolling, it would still be incredibly hard for China. Projecting power all the way to Hormuz and Malacca is a massive challenge, because to control those areas, China would have to outperform local powers in each region. Geopolitics isn't a fair competition or global talent show. Where the conflict occurs changes everything. It reshuffles all rankings. And historically, the only empire to project naval power globally was, well, Britain came close, but ultimately, there were no cruise missiles or guided munitions back then and no aircraft capable of deep precision strike. So being able to strike accurately within 1,000 kilometers of the coastline, that level of naval firepower today, only the United States has it. So even when the US isn't actively patrolling, it's still hard to imagine the Chinese Navy effectively securing Hormuz and Malacca. Now imagine trying that with the US still present. So sure, China takes Taiwan, but then what? What's next? So what now? Are they planning to starve? You've taken Taiwan, great. But are you going to let hundreds of millions of Chinese starve? Here's the reality check. China has virtually no meaningful allies. Its formal partners are Pakistan, Myanmar, and Iran. It's trying to cozy up to Saudi Arabia too, but that's just Riyadh telling Washington, we want to have our own voice. Would they really side with China and risk enraging the US? Highly unlikely. I don't believe they're that reckless. And if you look at Saudi royal history, it's a messy, cutthroat lineage, but they've survived by picking the right side every time. They don't make foolish choices. So let's say China's allies are Pakistan, Myanmar, Iran, and sure, let's throw in North Korea. That's China's side. Now compare that with the US alliance network, massive and formidable. So if China invades Taiwan, the world essentially divides, US bloc versus China bloc. No one in their right mind would say, sure, let's back China after they've annexed Taiwan. If war breaks out over that, what happens? Chances are Korea would descend into internal conflict first. Let's do a side-by-side comparison. In terms of total surface naval power, aircraft carriers, destroyers, cruisers, The US and its allies, including Korea, have 216 ships. China, 80. We're not even talking about quality, just raw numbers. As for submarines, the US and allies have 183. China has 59. That's the current reality. We're only comparing numbers here, not quality. That's why China still isn't ready to make a move on Taiwan. It needs more preparation. Even before the war in Ukraine, geopolitical analysts were already aware of this. Xi Jinping has surely taken note of the Ukraine situation. Even if he doesn't say it publicly, he's watching closely. Because even without direct US involvement in the fighting, the US and the West have made things extremely difficult for Russia. The Russian economy is reportedly on the brink of collapse. Xi has seen this, and it's becoming common knowledge. Yet Russia is energy self-sufficient. It doesn't rely on imports. What it lacks is industrial manufacturing self-sufficiency. But in terms of food and energy, Russia is self-reliant, which gives it imperial resilience, much like the Soviet Union once was. There was a time when it had more self-sufficiency than even the US. The US wasn't always energy independent. That has changed now, of course. But the Soviet Union had food, energy, and strong military power, which allowed it to rival the US at one point. And it was geographically open in all directions. China, by contrast, is sealed off on one side, and it lacks both food and energy self-sufficiency. If China wants to be taken seriously in global geopolitics, it needs to be self-sufficient in at least one, ideally both of those categories. And it's not. So to at least secure one of the two, Chinese bureaucrats, especially the more rational ones, are now pushing electric vehicles. Under the banner of green energy, China is pursuing this aggressively, at a level of state support comparable to that of the US. This chart on the right shows the share of electric vehicles in new car sales since 2021. There are three main goals: environmental reform, export growth, and energy independence. But let's be honest, it's primarily about energy independence. EVs already make up over 10% of new car sales, and the target is 20% by 2025. Hyundai and Volkswagen both have a presence in China, right? But in the EV sector, only Chinese brands or Tesla are allowed to compete. Other foreign brands don't stand a chance in the domestic market. China's obsession with EVs makes perfect sense if you consider its energy insecurity geopolitically. You've probably heard of the so-called Teslamists. Elon Musk, brilliant, yes, but also a master showman. A lot of people get dazzled by that performance. But this is geopolitics. Not everything can be solved with EVs. We really need to study batteries like lithium and the rare materials used in them. We have to think seriously about sourcing those critical minerals, and also about the efficiency of secondary batteries. It's not just about Elon Musk's theatrics. Sure, reverse landing rockets are impressive, so we tend to assume if he can do that, he can do this too. EVs don't work like that. There are conditions and limitations. And from China's perspective, EVs aren't a complete solution either. They say they'll convert 75% of vehicles to EVs by 2030. But have you heard the catch? Have you ever heard of an electric aircraft carrier? Or a jet fighter powered entirely by electricity? Has anyone even proposed such an idea? A jet fighter breaking the sound barrier without liquid or solid fuel? Has Elon Musk ever claimed that's coming? Said, once electricity advances enough, jets will be electric too. Has he ever said that? We need to stay grounded in reality. Realistically, securing fossil fuels remains one of the most important issues in modern geopolitics. But here's the twist. The US no longer needs Middle Eastern oil. In that sense, the US today resembles the old Soviet Union. It's fully self-sufficient in food. In fact, it's a major food exporter. And now it's also energy independent. That's how the Soviet Union used to be during the Cold War. So the USSR constantly stirred up the Middle East to destabilize the US, because America's strategic choke point was the Middle East. That's why, even though Saudi Arabia was so problematic, the US turned a blind eye to all human rights concerns and protected the Saudi regime no matter what they did. That's because the US isn't an empire. If it were, it would have annexed Saudi. That's what real imperialism looks like. But since annexation was off the table, Washington tolerated everything. That's the reality of the Saudi royal family. Whatever they did, they got a pass. Why? Because the US didn't have energy independence. It was on a leash. The USSR knew this and kept destabilizing the region. That's how much of a geopolitical headache the Middle East was for the United States. Under President Reagan, but before him, President Carter had become overly idealistic. He failed to grasp the severity of the Iranian Revolution. He saw it as a democratic or nationalist movement. If Nixon, ever the realist, had been in power, he would have intervened. He likely would have prevented the fall of the Pahlavi dynasty, or at least ensured that someone other than Khomeini succeeded it. He might even have had Khomeini assassinated. But Carter, as an idealist, just watched. And what happened? Iran didn't reward America's idealism. They humiliated it. The US embassy was seized for more than a year, if you recall. Hostages nearly died. Some escaped in dramatic fashion. Under Reagan's more realist administration, Iraq and Iran ended up at war. Well, he didn't exactly start it, but as later scandals revealed, Reagan's team sold weapons to both Iraq and Iran. It wasn't for money, it was a geopolitical calculation. but it violated US law and the Constitution and became the biggest scandal of Reagan's presidency, selling arms to designated enemy states. Because having Iraq and Iran locked in prolonged war was America's most effective revenge against Iran. That's when Saddam Hussein rose to prominence. And as always, the US ends up troubled by the very forces it helped empower. That's because the US isn't a true empire. An empire would have just taken over. It's hard to act imperial without being an empire. That contradiction is real and exhausting. Iran and Iraq weren't developed nations or commercial powers, yet they were sinking each other's merchant ships in the Strait of Hormuz. So what is the essence of American leadership? It's that nations around the world looked up to the US. We did too, though today people are more skeptical, even anti-American at times. But Koreans of an older generation grew up watching black and white American shows, thinking, I want to go to America. It wasn't just us, the whole world admired America. Why was US leadership admired? Back then people were more romantic, more idealistic, because Hollywood actors were good looking. Sure, that helped. Soft power played a big role. But the US essentially said, whether you're friend or foe, we'll keep trade open. No need to worry. In a world led by the US, there were no pirates. For nearly 30 years, maritime insurance companies had nothing to do. They just kept collecting premiums. From about 1945 through the late 1960s, ships weren't sinking. Claims were rare and profits rolled in. Then Iran and Iraq, despite not being trade powers, started sinking each other's commercial ships. And with ships, it's often just a matter of changing the flag. Most of the countries investing in those ships were European and similar economies. If your ships mostly frequented Iranian ports, you'd sail under the Iranian flag or the Iraqi flag, depending on what was more convenient. That's all it was. But a few of those ships got bombed. And suddenly, global insurance companies were facing collapse. Two countries with almost no weight in global trade waged war, and just a few ships sank, and that was enough to trigger a crisis that required major reinsurers to intervene. It's like when a disaster hits here in Gangnam, and insurers rely on major global reinsurers to survive the payout. That way, they don't go under from a single major loss event. But even the reinsurers were being pushed to the brink, and global maritime trade nearly collapsed. That's how fragile the system really is. So what did President Reagan do? He sent in naval ships to patrol the waters. Even if it wasn't an American ship, a US vessel would escort and protect it. From a financial perspective, that's a losing proposition, because the value of the cargo ship was far less than the cost of operating a destroyer. But they did it anyway. Why? To prevent the collapse of the global financial system. Because insurance companies are systemically critical. If insurers go down, the entire financial system follows. So Iran and Iraq sink a few ships during their war, insurance companies start to fail, then the reinsurers follow, and suddenly you've got a global financial crisis. That's why the US started patrolling. That's what defined the American-led era. The hallmark of the American-led era was this. You could sail and trade freely across the world's oceans, anywhere. The Middle East used to be a major headache for the US, but now it's no longer strategically essential. That's the reality now. That's why President Obama was able to launch the Pivot to Asia strategy. They reassessed the Middle East and asked, why are we even fighting here? We have no real interest anymore. In fact, we're now energy independent, so our real interests lie with that growing power across the Pacific, China. What matters is maintaining our alliances in that region. So this pivot back to Asia, it wasn't Trump, it was Obama who initiated it. He even began the withdrawal, first from Afghanistan, then from Iraq. Now, let's return to World War I. Wars are expensive, tremendously so. In 4 years, the powers poured over $200 billion into the war. Most covered it through inflation, printing money. But Britain and France had the advantage of a wealthy ally, the United States. Britain borrowed from the US and in turn lent to France and Russia. Thanks to American capital, they didn't have to overinflate their currencies. Germany, which lacked that alliance, expanded its money supply fourfold. As we discussed earlier, under Kaiser Wilhelm II, Germany had even stockpiled gold in preparation for war. But as it turned out, gold alone couldn't prepare you for war, because World War I became a war of attrition, one that devoured unimaginable sums of money. They simply printed more money. It shows what happens when you go to war without strong alliances. War doesn't only happen on the battlefield. Russia may seem powerful, but look how much it's struggling. Ukraine has allies. The West and the US are backing them like true allies. And even we're playing a supporting role, albeit indirectly. We've been exporting massive amounts of arms to Poland. Poland, in turn, is lending its own weapons to Ukraine and replacing them with Korean-made ones. So in the end, those weapons might essentially be ours. That means we're effectively part of the alliance. We're definitely not selling weapons to Russia, right? Alliances are everything in war. So now let's see how vulnerable China actually is. Back to China again. You remember the Wall Street crisis in 2008, right? Xi Jinping's rise is tied in many ways to the aftermath of 2008. That year, the US faltered badly. And the global financial system, we study geopolitics here to better understand Bitcoin, among other things. The system has major blind spots. It's credit stacked upon more credit with no hard cap to contain it. And eventually, democracy, with all its idealism, intersects with the system. And you get, hey, you buy a house, you too. Everyone gets a house. So everyone bought homes they couldn't afford. This didn't start under President Bush. It actually started during the Clinton administration. You get paid to buy a house, not the other way around. Buy a house and they hand you cash. And then they turned those homes into financial assets, sliced them into mortgage-backed securities. And major financial institutions traded them heavily on the markets. Eventually, it all collapsed. Watching this, Chinese elites felt a massive boost in self-confidence. In Korea, we didn't feel the full brunt of the crisis, partly because the government acted swiftly with currency swaps and such, but largely because of China's role. China didn't stumble much during the crisis, and we rode it out by massively increasing our exports to China. Meanwhile, US unemployment shot up, nearly 10% at its worst. It was a brutal time for many. And seeing the US struggle like that, China began to think, wait, we're the ones buying US debt and propping them up. Everyone thinks the US holds up the world, but we're holding up the US. And since the US supports the world, that means we are supporting the world. At the same time, throughout the Western world, including Korea, a wave of pro-China intellectuals began to gain influence. People were saying, the Chinese century has arrived. That deeply affected China's national confidence and explains a lot of the assertiveness we see today. Back then, to escape the crisis, the US expanded its monetary base, M1 and M2, by about 15%. Europe was relatively fragile. It had weak links like Greece dragging it down. They're spending like crazy but not working? Come on. Because of such economies, Europe had to expand its money supply by 80% to recover. Crisis after crisis followed the subprime meltdown, especially in Europe. You remember the European debt crisis. China, it appeared immune, so many believed it was strong. In some ways, that's true. But if you look at this graph, China has increased its money supply eightfold since the subprime crisis. China's GDP is just 60% of the US, but its money supply is twice that of the US. Isn't that alarming? That's the yuan. This one's the US dollar. This is the US. And that's China's yuan. No wonder the yuan isn't going global. No country wants to save in yuan. How could you trust a currency like that? Worse, these statistics are decided behind closed doors. At least in the US, there's a federal open market committee with public disclosures. Sure, it's stressful. Markets speculate like crazy before those meetings. Without that, half of financial YouTubers, they'd have nothing to talk about. They post videos forecasting the Fed's decision and then make follow-ups explaining what it means. Take that away and they'd run out of content, even if their forecasts are mostly wrong. It's basically a coin toss, half right, half wrong. But China doesn't even have that level of transparency. In any case, whether it's the US, Europe, China, or even Korea, they all operate under a fiat currency system completely detached from gold. This is what we call credit money, unbacked, irredeemable currency. Escaping crises by printing money, that's a legacy of World War I. After World War I erupted and ended, Britain and the US seized financial dominance. Britain even returned to its pre-war exchange rate, restoring the gold standard. At the time, global financiers believed money must be backed by gold. Unbacked money is fake, acceptable only during wartime emergencies. So after war, it was only logical to return to gold. They believed unbacked money inevitably causes problems. Many economists now call this a strategic error. They returned to gold, and what happened? The results were disastrous. As the West weakened, Hitler rose to power. He revitalized Germany with explosive force. Meanwhile, the US got slammed by the Great Depression. In the chaos, Hitler exploited the moment and lit another global fire. That's when Keynes and his ideas gained traction. So here's how it works. Imagine you're in a critical situation. Keynesian prescription would be, forget the long term. If you're crashing now, eat sugar. Have a drink, just don't collapse. If you're paralyzed and about to die, light a cigarette. That's Keynesianism in spirit. Now contrast that with, you're in this mess because you don't exercise, your diet is terrible, and your whole lifestyle needs a rethink. That's the gold standard philosophy. So really, whose advice would you rather follow? Enjoy life. Eat what you want, even if it kills you. Living healthy but stressed isn't worth it. Stress from quitting might kill you faster. Light one up. A stroke from stress? Just smoke. If you're stressed, drink up. That's just human. So which one would you prefer? Look, I've noticed your life's a mess, totally irregular. You need to start by waking up early. Set some goals. Get moving with purpose. Stop coming home and collapsing in front of the TV at night. Take a class. Learn about the geopolitics of Bitcoin or something. Of course you're different. You're here, studying late at night. Clearly not like the majority. You belong to the latter group, disciplined and self-directed. But most people statistically prefer the easy route. Then COVID hit. Governments printed money and handed it out to small businesses. Of course, that was popular. After World War I and World War II, the world witnessed the rise of figures like Hitler. And amid economic turmoil, Keynesian prescriptions gained dominance. Over time, they came to shape the way we think about crisis management even today. So when a crisis hits, the default is print money. The logic is forget the long term. We'll deal with that later. We assume the long term will somehow sort itself out. And that mindset is what you see in this graph right here. Compare it to China's line on the same chart. The United States has increased its money supply maybe 2- or 3-fold. Now it's trying to scale that back. But China? China went wild. After World War I ended in 1919, they held a peace conference that placed all blame squarely on Germany. Keynes believed that was the very cause of World War II, and he wasn't alone. Most historians agree with that assessment. At the time, Keynes interpreted it this way. And indeed, just as he predicted, peace didn't follow. Instability did. Why did they hit Germany so hard? Because France had been invaded by Germany twice in 50 years. So they didn't want Germany to rise again, deliberately, and while they couldn't reduce Germany to ashes, they thought it was best to leave it disorganized and weak. But the United States had a different view. America warned that punitive reparations would burden not just Germany, but all of Europe. They proposed limiting reparations to under $24 billion. It's hard for us to grasp that number today, but it was basically repay the equivalent of 2 years' income. You were at fault, so that's your penalty. That was America's proposal. The United Kingdom wanted $55 billion, about 5 years' worth. When the news broke in Germany, the public was outraged and stunned. The Treaty of Versailles imposed on Germany. It severed ties with Austria and dissolved its imperial structure. It imposed strict military limitations. The army was capped at 100,000 troops. They were forbidden from possessing modern weapons. Naval ships were limited to under 10,000 tons. U-boats and submarines, completely banned. Because submarines had caused so much devastation during the war, parts of mainland Germany were carved up and given to Denmark, Belgium, and others. Germany lost all of its overseas colonies, but most famously, £66 billion in reparations. Yes, £66 billion in total war reparations. Afterward, Germany printed vast amounts of money, triggering astronomical hyperinflation. For example, back in our school days, we'd have hair inspections, literally measuring hair lengths, 1 centimeter, 2 centimeters. You had to keep it within strict limits. Here's what would happen sometimes. Some kids would just shave their heads bald like monks, and then they'd get scolded or even hit by the teacher because it looked like an act of rebellion, right? That's exactly what Germany did. Screw it, we're already doomed, and let everything go. There's a great book by a German called Money Shock, and it makes a lot of sense. Let me introduce you to it. Every nation develops its own psychological template. For the United States, that trauma was the Great Depression. That is why America prefers inflation over deflation, always. They experienced 10, even 20 years of economic stagnation. Money stopped circulating. That's the US's trauma, the Great Depression. Germany, on the other hand, was traumatized by the hyperinflation of the Weimar Republic. 2 trillion marks couldn't even buy a pack of cigarettes. That kind of economic collapse scarred the German psyche. Even during the high inflation 1970s that affected Japan and others, the Deutsche Mark stood alone, barely touched by inflation. Germans took immense pride in the Deutsche Mark. So what did they give up that beloved currency for? The euro. They abandoned the mark and adopted the euro. Some conspiracy theorists say it was a French plot to get rid of the Deutsche Mark because they couldn't stand how dominant it was. But the German public was so emotionally attached to the mark that it seemed politically impossible until Chancellor Helmut Kohl pushed it through. Looking back, many now see that as a mistake. The Deutsche Mark was arguably the strongest and most stable currency in the world because Germans carry a deep cultural fear of inflation. When inflation spirals out of control, now Korea hasn't experienced true hyperinflation, so that trauma isn't etched into our memory. But imagine living in a society where your salary loses value if not spent immediately. If you're placed in that kind of environment, then all ethical norms and social structures start to collapse. Deflation brings stagnation, economic paralysis. It manifests as a kind of collective depression. Inflation is the opposite, but equally extreme. It forces people to act instantly, think frenetically. Everyone becomes greedy, hyper-competitive. How do I avoid being the one left behind? That's the kind of stress everyone lives with. Each country carries its own mental blueprint, its financial psychology. In the end, Geopolitics must be understood through the lens of finance. That's why I keep bringing it back to finance. During wartime, the Bank of England played a crucial role. It has since become the most influential model for modern central banks. We call it the Bank of England. It's now a nationalized institution. It was nationalized after 1945, but originally it was a private financial institution for over 250 years. During Britain's war efforts, French Protestants, specifically the Huguenots, who were Protestant, these Huguenots had fled persecution in France. So essentially, the Bank of England was founded by French refugees. They offered to lend the British government £1.2 million at 8% interest in perpetuity. In return, they were granted a monopoly on note issuance, the foundation of the Bank of England. So the Bank of England wasn't founded as a central bank. And even now, it's not that they formally declare we are the central bank. It simply evolved into that role through function, not title. Originally, it was just one bank among many, and in many ways, it operated like a commercial bank. But during World War I, it became increasingly subordinated to the British government. That's what war does. It rewires institutions. Originally, the board seats at the Bank of England were passed around among a few aristocratic families as honorary positions. So among the directors of the Bank of England, many didn't even know how banking worked or how banks made money. Most of them, in fact, were clueless. According to historical records, these were honorary titles. There's a district inside London known as the City of London. The Bank of England functioned almost like a feudal lord within that zone. It was a guild-based system built around finance, or we'll get into that today. What really matters is the City of London itself. The individual board members weren't that important. But then came Montagu Norman. He became governor of the Bank of England during World War I, and everything started to change. He served an exceptionally long term until around 1945. He even persuaded Churchill to return to the gold standard, which ended up devastating the British economy. Here's how stubborn the Bank of England's directors were. Even as the British government issued wartime financial directives, and remember, Canada was still part of the British Empire at that point, so Norman, the bank's governor, sent a letter to the Canadian governor, Graham Towers, telling him not to follow orders from the British Treasury. He got dragged in and scolded for it. Eventually, when the government threatened nationalization, the bank gave in. Through World War I, the Bank of England effectively became a servant of the state, and finance descended into disorder. Bankers, watching governments fight wars and disrupt the monetary system, tried to restore order through a return to the gold standard. The idea was, if we return to the gold standard, and since banks held the gold, then even without formal independence from the state, banks could still regain a measure of autonomy. You see, banks weren't always like what we think of today. Not like Worry Bank or Hana Bank serving under government control. Historically, they were not subordinate to the state. Some banks were older than the very nations they operated in. That's the origin of modern banking power. Wars were often the result of negotiations between monarchs and bankers. Kings needed to borrow from banks to wage war, so they had to court the favor of bankers. Because back then, if you printed paper money, no one would accept it. Only bank-issued notes were trusted. Banknotes were, at their core, backed by silver or gold. Unlike today, where financial institutions are entirely regulated by government entities, this subordination to agencies like central banking commissions began around World War I. But Korea's situation is different. Korean banks were created by the state from the beginning. We didn't develop an organic capitalist system from within. It was introduced from outside, so Korea can't be the baseline. But that's not how banking historically evolved elsewhere. Once money shifted from gold to paper, banks enjoyed the convenience of operating under state license, but completely lost their independence from the government. Put simply, today's financial system still functions like a wartime economy. And that wartime logic has lasted far too long. The Korean War was a massive shock to the US. The American economy struggled deeply during that time. Because of the Korean War, by the late 1950s, inflation in the US had surged to nearly 20%. Today, the Federal Reserve no longer takes orders from the Treasury. Sure, the Fed still pays attention to the Treasury, but officially, a formal agreement delineating their boundaries was signed during the Korean War. At the time, the Treasury complained that the Federal Reserve wouldn't follow orders, so they were summoned to the White House and President Truman let them have it. The Fed chairman at the time was Thomas McCabe, kind of like the CEO of a paper company like Korea's Yuhan Kimberly. Truman thought he'd be easy to control and appointed him Fed chair, but he turned out to be fiercely independent. He believed the Fed must not become subordinate to government and shouldn't be directly financing government debt. He resisted, but eventually got pushed out by the Treasury Secretary. As he stepped down, he left behind a legacy, the famous Treasury Federal Reserve Accord. Thanks to that memorandum, the Fed is no longer viewed as a servant of the executive branch, at least symbolically. Sometimes it even seems more powerful than the president himself. Everyone hangs on Chairman Powell's every word, right? It all ties back to war. Conflict reshapes institutions. And this is exactly what we've been trying to explore in depth. Just this past February, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson held talks with HSBC, Barclays, and Goldman Sachs, Lloyds, some of the most powerful banks in the world. He summoned top executives from those banks and told them, freeze all Russian assets, now. The City of London isn't a conventional administrative district. Think of it more as a symbolic and financial zone of power. You'll hear City of London come up often, so you need to understand what it is. It's arguably more important than the Bank of England itself. Think of it as the global version of Korea's Myeongdong private loan market, but legalized and enormous. The US and EU announced sanctions against 5 banks linked to the Kremlin and 3 individual oligarchs. Critics said it was far too soft. Then the British Prime Minister issued direct orders to the City of London, which is a very unusual move. The City of London is the epicenter of offshore finance and the Eurodollar market. Now, the term Eurodollar has nothing to do with the euro currency. In fact, it's not even tied directly to Europe. It's an incredibly misleading term. So what is a Eurodollar? It's easier to understand with a bit of historical context. In the early Cold War, the Soviet Union sold oil and got paid in US dollars. But just holding that cash, it didn't earn interest. Frustrating. Plus, storing stacks of physical dollars wasn't exactly practical. So they needed to deposit it somewhere. But definitely not in a US bank. Why not park it in a US bank? Imagine the Soviets depositing oil profits into American banks. What do you think would happen? If the Soviets stepped out of line, the US could just freeze the assets. Naturally, that annoyed them. So where could they put their money instead? Why not the City of London, that bastion of financial autonomy? And that's where they started placing their dollars. So US dollars started piling up in London-based banks. Why does that matter? Are those deposits covered by deposit insurance? Not at all. No protection. Normally, if you take dollar deposits, you're supposed to back them with reserves at a central bank. But foreign banks holding Soviet dollars didn't need to deposit anything at the Federal Reserve. They could lend out 100% of it. That's how a whole new financial system was born. Gold disappeared, but something else took its place in providing systemic discipline. A US dollar, yet one that operates beyond US sovereign control. It lacks 2 key things. First, there's no deposit insurance requirement. So the cost structure is lean. No need to insure depositors. Second, banks don't have to hold reserves with the Federal Reserve, which means they can turn that money over rapidly without constraints. Put simply, there exists a critical part of global finance that operates completely outside the reach of the US Federal Reserve, and it's denominated in US dollars. That's what we call the Eurodollar system. It was born from geopolitical necessity, out of loopholes within the US-led international order. Britain is clearly a US ally, yet even the British monarch couldn't interfere with the City of London, which is almost like a sovereign state within Britain. Just like medieval Europe, where the king ruled, but dukes and earls ran autonomous fiefdoms. It's a similar setup. So Soviet and Chinese funds, hoping to avoid US asset seizures, flowed there. That's why Russian money is still there, to this day. Makes sense now, right? So when the British Prime Minister said, freeze those assets, he was acting within the Eurodollar framework. These days, instead of Eurodollar, we often say euro currency, because it's not just about dollars anymore. You can have francs not tied to the French central bank and yen floating outside the control of the Bank of Japan. For example, Korea's 50,000 won note gets circulated abroad. Where? In northeastern China, it's reportedly used more than the yuan because it's trusted more. That Korean bill, it's essentially functioning like a Eurodollar. But since it's not backed by a bank, just circulated hand to hand among merchants, under the table, so to speak, it's hard to track and quantify. Still, that's the kind of thing we call a Eurodollar. The formal term for this is offshore finance. We call it offshore financing or offshore finance. But no one really calls it offshore finance in practice. Everyone just says Eurodollar. And Eurodollars are incredibly important. So what makes Eurodollars different from something like Myeongdong's private loan market? In the Myeongdong loan market, do they lend to people with strong credit or people with no credit? Obviously to people without credit. But Eurodollar markets only deal with the highest credit clients. It started with Soviet money. But Eurodollars became systemically crucial. Why? Because in the 1970s, the Middle East weaponized oil and cue the oil shock. These oil states, previously seen as primitive, suddenly had tons of money. They had no idea how to manage it all, totally overwhelmed. There's even a meme that captures this. You know how Saudi has more princes than you can count? One prince goes, "Dad, do you know Lee Kun-hee?" Who's that? He's the guy behind Samsung. Oh, the phone salesman? That's how he responds. To a Saudi prince, Lee Kun-hee is just a guy who sells phones. So they were overflowing with cash. What do they do with it? That money became Eurodollars. Once it entered the Eurodollar system, it got recycled into parts of the world that needed capital. So even though the Middle East weaponized oil and countries like Korea and Japan were hit hard, the global economy itself didn't collapse because that money circulated through the Eurodollar system. It functioned like a high-speed shadow lending market. Some Eurodollar loans were as short as half a day. literally hours. They call that overnight paper or one-day maturity. So imagine someone with pristine credit, not just a few million, but let's say Samsung Electronics, suddenly receives several hundred billion won in prepayments. If they lock that up for just one day, it earns interest, real money. If they let it sit idle, nothing. But in Eurodollars, it earns. And if someone suddenly needs cash for a day, boom, it moves instantly. There's almost no risk, so they jump in. That's what LIBOR is. Heard of it? LIBOR gets published every morning. LIBOR is calculated for different terms. There's overnight, 1 month, 1 week used to be ideal, but it seems to have been discontinued probably because it became too central. LIBOR stands for London Interbank Offered Rate. It's the interest rate banks in London charge each other for short-term lending. We usually watch the Fed chair's lips for guidance on interest rates, right? But in reality, and I'm not the only one saying this, it's the bankers in the City of London who actually move global interest rates. Sure, the Fed chair still influences things because of arbitrage opportunities. Like, why are our rates higher than theirs? The market self-corrects. Still, London banks call each other up for overnight lending. Hey, can you lend me 200 billion won just for tonight? And the other bank transfers the funds, but the interest rate quoted is annualized, even if the loan lasts just 1 day. This rate is published daily. So what is it right now? I looked it up for you. As of October 20th, 2022, the 1-year LIBOR rate was 5.42%. Let me tell you, a few months ago, when I took out a loan, it was a mortgage loan, and I had to decide fixed or variable interest rate. Based on everything I know geopolitically, rates were only going to rise. So I went with fixed, just to avoid the stress. But it was expensive, 5.3%. At the time, the base rate was still in the 3% range, so I locked it in high. Now I look at LIBOR, 5.32%. That's where it stands now. Even top-rated global banks are borrowing overnight at 5.32%. Not that it's 5.32% for one night, but annualized, that's the rate. Student loans, mortgages, almost all loans are priced as a spread above LIBOR. Is there anyone here who has better credit than the global LIBOR banks? Even the Korean government pays a spread on top of LIBOR to borrow. So if you're on a variable rate, yeah, you're toast. You're probably looking at 6% soon, right? Sure, a 1-month loan might be at 3.5%, but a mortgage is long-term. So that's the benchmark. And hey, turns out I made the right bet. Now I'm thinking, good call on the fixed rate. It's published daily, every single day. Here's the bottom line. Way too many people talk about Bitcoin as if America will do this or that. Even people I know, educated ones. When it's folks without an economics background, I get it. They just don't know. But when I hear this from people who actually studied economics, it's clear they haven't studied enough. Even during the so-called American-led financial order, most of the actual capital flows happened outside US control. The Eurodollar system was massive, absolutely massive. Why does the Eurodollar system even exist? Because everyone wants to benefit from the US-built stability, but without submitting to its authority. That tension defines the system. Loan sharks operate only because there's a functioning police force, right? But loan sharks only function because they benefit from police protection. Without police, the loan shark market collapses. It would devolve into a den of thieves and anarchy, right? The system exists precisely because there's order outside it. The whole point is to avoid paying taxes or being regulated by the government. They want to benefit from the stability the US provides, but without US interference. That's exactly what Eurodollars were created for. Korea benefited immensely from this system during the Cold War. Samsung Electronics, they've had an office in London for this very reason. Need cash? Boom. Overnight 1-week loans, done. But they don't lend to us regular folks. This is unregulated money, no deposit insurance. Only top-tier institution-grade borrowers are allowed in. This is real finance. It's a point I keep trying to emphasize in this course. You need to open your eyes. This is what real finance actually looks like. This is the true power of finance. And this is the market Bitcoin is aiming to disrupt. That's the perspective you need to develop. We'll stop here for today. It's getting late. Take care, everyone.